I want to tell you about a Tuesday morning when the law almost did something unforgivable. Not out of cruelty, that would have been easier to explain. Out of indifference, out of the quiet, mechanical indifference of a system that sends letters and waits for answers, and never once stops to ask whether the person on the other end of that envelope can actually read. A man walked into my courtroom that morning in a navy suit, old cut, clean, cared for. His tie was knotted slightly wrong, just a few degrees off center. He couldn't see it. Nobody fixed it. And the moment I noticed that, I knew that whatever was written in the file in front of me was not the whole story, not even close. $940. That was what the state wanted from him. Nearly $1,000 in fines, a warrant for his arrest, and a case number that treated him like a man who had simply chosen, 3 times in a row, to ignore the law. He hadn't ignored anything. He couldn't. He was a 2-tour Vietnam veteran who had given this country 11 years in uniform, come home carrying things no file could document, and was now sitting in my courtroom, alone, without an attorney, his clouded eyes facing the direction of my voice, because for 18 months, the system he had served had not sent a single human being to his door. Just letters, 3 of them, to a man who lived in the dark. When I looked up from that file and asked him the only question that ever really matters in this room, what he said next stopped the entire courtroom cold. But before I tell you what happened, before I tell you what I found, what I said, and what arrived on my desk 7 months later in an envelope addressed in handwriting that broke something open in my chest. Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if stories about justice, empathy, and hidden truths move you the way they move me, make sure you subscribe to the channel. We tell these stories every week. And this one is worth staying for. Some cases walk into your courtroom wearing a sign. The sign says, "This is going to cost you something." Not money, not time. Something harder to name, the particular ache that settles behind your sternum when the law and justice decide right in front of you to part ways and walk in opposite directions. I have been a judge for 31 years. I have presided over murders, divorces, custody battles that would break a novelist's heart. I have heard confessions that made the stenographer put down her pen. I have delivered sentences that I rehearsed in the mirror the night before because I needed to hear how they sounded out loud before I allowed them to exist in the world. And still, after all of it, some mornings surprise you. That Tuesday in late November was the kind of morning that discourages optimism. The sky outside the courthouse was the color of old concrete. The heating system in courtroom 4 had been reported for the 3rd time that month and repaired for the 2nd, which meant it ran, but only in the sense that a car with a cracked engine block runs. Technically, reluctantly, and not for long. My clerk, Sandra, had brought a space heater from home and positioned it beneath her desk with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had long since stopped filing maintenance requests and started solving problems herself. I remember sitting in my chair before the session opened, looking at the docket. 14 cases, a Tuesday load, traffic violations, a small claims dispute, 2 noise ordinance hearings, routine. The kind of docket that you move through like a man clearing a table, methodically, without sentiment. Case 11, City of Hartford versus Harold Eugene Watts. Municipal notice violations, failure to appear. $940. I read it twice. Then I read the attachment. Then I set the file down and looked at the frost collecting at the corner of the courtroom window for a moment. I have learned in 3 decades on this bench that a file can mislead you, not through lies, through omission. The law is a document. Documents record what happened. They do not always record why. And the distance between what happened and why it happened is often the entire moral territory of a human life. I called the session to order at 9:14. The room settled, chairs scraped, someone coughed near the back. The radiator ticked once, twice, then went silent again like it had thought better of the effort. When Harold Watts was called, I watched the door. I have seen many people walk into this courtroom afraid. Fear has a specific grammar in this room. The hunched shoulders, the eyes that find the floor first and only look up when forced. I have seen young men trying very hard to look like they are not young men who are frightened. I have seen women gripping their handbags the way people grip things when they need something solid to hold on to. What I had not seen, not like this, was a man walk in and be genuinely, practically uncertain of where he was going. He came through the side door with a young woman at his left elbow, his granddaughter, I would learn later, and in his right hand he carried an aluminum cane, the kind issued by the VA, though someone had wrapped several inches of the handle in black electrical tape, the way you do when a thing is breaking and you cannot replace it yet. He wore a navy suit. The cut was old, wide lapels, the kind of suit that remembered a different decade. The fabric had been cleaned many times. It sat on his shoulders with the particular dignity of clothes that have been cared for beyond their natural lifespan. His tie was off-center, just slightly, knotted with care but angled wrong, a few degrees to the left, so that the tip hung not quite straight. He could not see it. No one had fixed it. I noticed it the way you notice something that tells you everything before a single word is spoken. He had dressed with intention. He had put on his best. And he had done it in the dark, literally in the dark, because the darkness was not a metaphor for Harold Watts. It was a Tuesday morning like any other. His granddaughter guided him to the defendant's table. He placed the cane against the edge, felt the chair with the back of his knee, and sat. Then he straightened his jacket. Then he folded his hands on the table in front of him. His eyes, clouded, still, the pale gray-white of a winter sky, faced forward, not toward me exactly, toward the general idea of where authority might be located. The room was very quiet. I looked at the file again. Then I looked at him. Some cases walk in wearing a sign, I thought. This one walked in wearing a flag. The law, at its most mechanical, is a beautiful and terrible thing. Beautiful because it does not flinch. It does not have bad days. It does not feel sorry for you, and it does not feel sorry for itself. It simply stands there, fixed, indifferent, immovable, like a wall that was built before you were born and will remain long after you are gone. Terrible for exactly the same reasons. My prosecutor that morning was a man named Gerald Fitch, 29 years old. 3 years out of law school. Competent, organized, the kind of young attorney who color-coded his case files and arrived 15 minutes early to everything. I did not dislike Gerald Fitch. He was doing his job. That is the thing people forget when they watch these proceedings from the outside. Almost everyone in a courtroom is doing their job. The system is not usually operated by villains. It is operated by people following procedure. And sometimes procedure and justice rhyme, and sometimes they do not. And the difference between a good courthouse and a bad one is whether anyone in the room notices when they stop rhyming. Gerald stood and opened his folder with the crisp efficiency of a man who had done this 40 times and expected to do it 40 more before Christmas. He read the charges. 3 municipal notices, he said, sent to the registered address of Harold Eugene Watts over a period of 7 months. The notices concerned a required review of his veterans' housing benefit, a routine administrative process, he emphasized, required of all recipients every 2 years. Failure to respond to the first notice resulted in a follow-up. Failure to respond to the second resulted in a formal warning and an initial fine of $310. Failure to respond to the third resulted in an escalated fine, bringing the total to $940, and the automatic scheduling of a mandatory appearance hearing, an appearance Mr. Watts had also failed to make, resulting in today's warrant. Gerald closed the folder. $940. A warrant. A Tuesday morning in a cold courtroom. He said it all in under 2 minutes. Clean, factual, correct. Every word of it was correct. I looked at Harold Watts while Gerald spoke. Harold did not move. He sat with his hands folded, his clouded eyes forward, his posture the posture of a man who had been told to sit up straight so many decades ago that his spine had simply memorized the instruction. Beside him, his granddaughter, Diane, I had seen the name in the file, sat with her hands in her lap, her eyes moving between Gerald and me, trying to read the room the way people do when they are afraid and have no legal training, and are trying to use instinct as a substitute for knowledge. The space heater under Sandra's desk clicked on. The radiator said nothing. Gerald sat. I let the silence stay for a moment. $940 for a man living on a veteran's pension. I had looked up the average VA non-service connected pension before the session. I had done this quietly, in my chambers, with my reading glasses on and my door closed, the way I do when I am preparing to understand something rather than simply adjudicate it. The figure I found was not a figure that left much room for $940. It was not a figure that left much room for anything beyond rent, utilities, and the particular arithmetic of surviving. I looked at the file again, at the address, at the name of the benefit program, at the dates, 7 months of notices, 7 months of letters sent to a man who could not read them, living alone in a 1-bedroom apartment, waiting on a list. I set the file down. I have a habit. My wife pointed it out to me years ago, and I have never been able to break it, of removing my glasses when I am about to say something that matters. She said it was because I needed to see things clearly before I spoke about them. And taking the glasses off was my mind's way of forcing a pause. I do not know if she was right. I only know that I took them off then, and I cleaned them on my sleeve, and for a moment the courtroom was a soft blur of shapes and gray morning light. I put them back on. Harold Watts came back into focus, the tie still slightly wrong, the hands still folded, the eyes still forward. The clock on the wall read 9:22. I leaned forward. I had 100 procedural questions available to me. I could have asked about certified mail confirmations. I could have asked about the appeals window. I could have asked Gerald whether the municipality had any record of verbal outreach, of a phone call, of a single human being picking up a telephone and dialing the number on file to ask why no one had responded. I did not ask any of those things first. I asked the only question that has ever mattered in this room, the question underneath every question, the one that the law is too dignified to ask but that justice requires. I looked at Harold Eugene Watts and I said quietly, so that the room had to lean in to hear it, "Mr. Watts, why didn't you respond?" He did not answer immediately. That is the thing about a real answer. It takes a moment to find. Rehearsed answers come fast. Lies come fast. But the truth, the kind that has been sitting in a person's chest for months gathering weight, needs a second to clear the distance between where it lives and where the words come out. Harold Watts unfolded his hands. He placed them flat on the table. Then he turned his face, not quite toward me, slightly to the left of me, the way blind people orient themselves towards sound. And he said, "I didn't respond, Your Honor, because I didn't know there was anything to respond to." The room was very still. "I don't receive mail," he continued, "not in any way that helps me. Letters come through the slot. I hear them. Sometimes Diane comes on the weekend and reads them to me. Sometimes a neighbor. But a neighbor has a life, and my granddaughter works 6 days a week." He paused. "I asked the VA for a reader, someone assigned. They told me there was a waiting list. That was 18 months ago. I'm still waiting. I wrote nothing. I simply listened. There is a skill that law school does not teach, and that most people on the bench learn slowly, if they learn it at all. The skill of listening to what is not being performed. Harold Watts was not performing. He was not leaning into the sympathy of the room. He was not softening his voice for effect, or letting his chin tremble at the strategic moment. He was simply reporting facts in the same tone a man uses when he has made peace with things he should not have had to make peace with. That tone is one of the saddest sounds a courtroom can produce. "Mr. Watts," I said, "can you tell me about your vision?" "Glaucoma," he said. "Progressive. Started about 8 years ago. By the time I retired from my last job, I was doing phone-based customer service. I could still do that. It was already most of the way gone. 6 years ago it finished." A pause. "The doctors at the VA believe it was accelerated by Agent Orange exposure. They believe it." Another pause. "The kind that carries something cold inside it. They don't put that in writing." I heard someone shift in their seat behind the bar. I did not look up. "Where did you serve?" I asked. "Vietnam. 2 tours. 68 to 72. 25th Infantry Division." "You were how old?" 19 when I shipped out the first time, Your Honor." 19. I let that number exist in the room for a moment without rushing past it. 19 years old, shipped to a jungle on the other side of the world, handed a rifle, told that what he was doing mattered. And he had believed it. I could see that he had believed it, not in a naive way, not in the way of a man who had never had reason to doubt, but in the way of a man who had chosen, over and over again across a long life, to continue believing that showing up was worth something. He had shown up today in his best suit. I looked at Diane. She was not crying loudly. She was the kind of person who cries quietly, as though she has learned somewhere along the way that her grief is not entitled to take up space. The tears were simply there on her face, unhurried, like rain on a window. "Mr. Watts," I said, "do you know how much this fine is?" Diane told me, $940. "And your monthly pension?" He told me the figure. I will not repeat it here. I will only say that when he said it, Gerald Fitch, young, organized, color-coded Gerald Fitch, looked down at his folder and did not look back up for a long time. I removed my glasses. I cleaned them. I put them back on. And then I did something I rarely do before delivering a verdict. I stood up, not fully. I placed my hands on the bench and I rose slightly, the way a man does when he needs the words to carry further than usual, when he needs what he is about to say to reach not just the person in front of him, but the room, the walls, the record, the cold November air itself. "Mr. Watts," I said, "I have been on this bench for 31 years. In that time I have seen the law applied with precision and with wisdom, and on more occasions than I care to count, with a breathtaking indifference to the human being standing in front of it." I let that land. "The municipality sent you 3 letters. They were correct to notify you. The process they were following exists for legitimate reasons. None of that is in dispute." I paused. "What is in dispute? What this court finds not merely troubling but unacceptable is that at no point in 7 months did any person, any office, any representative of the system that you served for 11 years in uniform pick up a telephone and ask why you had not responded. At no point did anyone consider that silence might mean something other than defiance." The radiator clicked. The space heater hummed. "You were 19 years old when this country asked you for something," I said. "You gave it 2 tours, your health and most of your sight. In return, this city sent you 3 letters you couldn't read, and then charged you $940 for not reading them." I picked up the file. I looked at it one last time. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted the room to see me look at it. I wanted everyone present to understand that I had read it, that I knew what was in it, that what I was about to do was not sentiment, it was a correction. The fine is dismissed, all $940, effective immediately. The warrant is vacated. The record will reflect no fault on the part of the defendant. I heard Diane make a sound, small, involuntary, the sound a person makes when they have been braced for impact and the impact does not come. Harold Watts sat very still. Then he nodded once, a single, slow nod, the nod of a man who has received orders and understood them and is processing what they mean. Furthermore, I said, this court will be submitting a formal written request to the Department of Veterans Affairs and to the city's Office of Accessibility Services, requesting that Mr. Watts be elevated to priority status for home support assistance. I set the gavel down. I did not strike it. I simply placed it on the bench, quietly, like setting down something you have been carrying for a while. Mr. Watts, I said, and my voice was different now, lower, off the record in every sense that mattered. Thank you for your service, not as a formality, as a fact. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you, Your Honor." And the voice, that straight-backed, measured military voice, wavered, just once, just slightly, just enough. I have thought about Harold Watts on many Tuesday mornings since then. Not every Tuesday, but enough of them that the association has become something close to a ritual. The cold light through the frosted window, the sound of the heating system deciding whether or not to cooperate, the docket on my desk waiting to be read. On those mornings, I sometimes pause before opening the first file, and I think about a man in a navy suit, sitting in the direction of my voice, his hands folded on the table, telling me the truth in the quiet tone of someone who has made peace with things he should not have had to make peace with. I think about the tie. I think about how he knotted it in the dark, with care, because he was coming to a place that mattered, and he wanted to look right for it. And how nobody fixed it, and how he never knew. That detail has stayed with me longer than almost anything else from that November. Not because it is tragic, though it is, but because it is so completely human. We all, in our own ways, walk into rooms with our ties slightly wrong, dressed with the best intentions, unable to see the small things that are off, hoping that the effort counts for something, even when the result isn't quite what we intended. Sometimes it does. In the weeks following the hearing, I did something I do not often do. I followed up personally. I placed a call to the regional director of the VA's Benefit Support Division, a woman I had met twice at a state bar conference and whose competence I respected. And I told her without legal formality and without a letter exactly what had happened in courtroom 4 on that Tuesday morning. I told her about 11 years of service, about 2 tours, about Agent Orange and the letters that arrived through a mail slot to a man who could hear them land but could not read them, about 18 months on a waiting list. She was quiet for a moment after I finished. Then she said, "I'll make some calls." Those 4 words, in my experience, either mean nothing at all or they mean everything. In this case, they meant everything. 6 weeks later, 6 weeks after 18 months of waiting, Harold Watts was assigned a support coordinator through the city's Veterans Accessibility Program. Her name was Patricia. She was 53 years old, a retired postal worker, trained as a volunteer reader and home visitor. She came to his apartment every Tuesday morning. She read him his mail, all of it, every letter, every notice, every piece of paper that arrived through the slot and landed on the floor in the dark. She sorted it, she read it aloud, she helped him respond when a response was needed. She also, I was told, brought coffee. Harold took his with 2 sugars, no cream. She remembered without being asked. Within 4 months, Harold's housing benefit had been successfully reviewed and renewed. The very process that had generated the original notices. And a separate claim he had been unable to pursue, related to the Agent Orange exposure, was formally reopened with the assistance of a VA advocate Patricia connected him to. I did not learn most of this directly. I learned it the way you learn things when you are a judge and you make a quiet inquiry, and the information finds its way back to you through the particular informal channels that courthouse relationships create over 3 decades. I learned some of it from Sandra, my clerk, who had apparently taken it upon herself to check in with the Veterans Services Office periodically, and who reported back to me with the efficiency of someone who understood, without it ever being discussed, that I wanted to know. I learned one piece of it directly. About 7 months after the hearing, I was leaving the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon. Late, well past 5. The kind of leaving that happens when the paperwork refuses to end. And I found an envelope on my desk that Sandra had left before going home. It was a standard white envelope, addressed in handwriting that was large and slightly uneven in the way of someone writing by feel rather than sight, with the letters formed by memory rather than vision. Inside was a single index card. On it, in that same large, uneven handwriting, were 11 words. You treated me like I still mattered. Thank you, Judge. I read it twice. Then I put it in the top drawer of my desk. Not the filing drawer, not the archive. The top drawer. The one I open every morning when I sit down. The one that has a photograph of my wife and a note my daughter wrote me when she was 7 years old, and a small coin from my brother's military service that I have kept for 50 years. It is still there. I tell this story not because it ended perfectly. It did not end perfectly, because very few things do. Harold Watts is still blind. He is still living on a pension that asks him to perform the quiet miracle of making too little feel like enough. The VA still moves slowly. The waiting lists are still too long. The system that sent 3 letters to a man who could not read them has not fundamentally changed in the ways that would prevent it from doing the same thing to someone else next month or next year. I tell it because of what it contains. It contains a man who showed up in a suit with a cane in the dark to face something he did not fully understand, because he believed that showing up was what you did. It contains a young woman who came straight from her shift, still in her work uniform, because her grandfather needed someone to hold his arm, and she was the person who would do that. It contains the reminder that the law is a tool, and tools are only as good as the hands that hold them, and that sometimes the most important thing a hand can do is pause before it acts and ask, who is this person, and what is actually happening here? The courtroom is not always a place of punishment. On its best days, on the days that make 31 years feel like they meant something, it is a place where a person who has been moving through the world unseen walks in, and for a few minutes is fully seen. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything. If this story stayed with you, if Harold Watts's Tuesday morning sitting in that cold courtroom in his best suit with his tie slightly wrong made you feel something, then you already understand why this channel exists. Every week we bring you the cases that don't make headlines, but do make you remember that behind every file number is a human being with a history and a reason and a life that the paperwork can't fully contain. Subscribe if you haven't. Hit the bell. Not for us, for the next story. Because somewhere in a courthouse right now, someone is walking up to a bench not knowing what they're about to face. And they deserve to have someone in the room paying attention. We'll be here. We always will. If this story stayed with you, pause for just a moment and ask yourself something honest. Have you ever been failed by a system you trusted? One you gave something to, served faithfully, believed in, only to find that when you needed it most, it sent you a letter you couldn't answer? Have you ever walked into a room dressed in your best, carrying your dignity like a shield, while the world around you moved too fast to notice the tie was slightly wrong? And have you ever had someone, one person, in one unexpected moment, look past the file and see the human being instead? Harold Watts didn't need a miracle that Tuesday. He needed someone to ask why. That's all any of us ever need. Leave your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one. And if you believe in stories about dignity, about the debt we owe the people who served, and about the kind of justice that looks a person in the eye before it speaks, subscribe to this channel, because there are more people out there waiting to be seen, and we're not done telling their stories.